Alright, Muffin here. So, had a subscriber request, I believe, a little while back. Going to be doing best and worst gun depression overall from tiers 1 through 10. Now, you may ask, why is gun depression important? Gun depression has a very strong impact on the game that can really change your play style of how you play some tanks rather than others, how you engage your enemies compared to others, and can really be a strength to your tank, or it can be a big weakness. So when you're in the battle and you're playing a tank that doesn't have a lot of gun depression, that could be a weakness, because if you put yourself in positions where there's hills and you're trying to get your cannon down enough to get shots off the enemy, that can actually put you in a really bad spot. And if you've watched any of my tips and tricks videos, those type of tanks I typically refer to as flat ground tanks. You want to stay more on flat ground because they just don't have that gun depression. Whereas tanks that have great gun depression, you can actually utilize those ridgeline, those hills, and peek over, not exposing your tank very much, get that cannon down and get those great shots off. Whereas a tank that doesn't have very good gun depression, you end up having to crest your tank up over the hill almost completely, exposing most of your tank just to get that shot sometimes off that enemy. So going off of this is completely off of Blitz stars data, and basically how it works is the greater the number in terms of gun depression, the better, and the lower the number is actually worse. So starting right off here at tier 1, the best tank that had for gun depression is actually no longer in the game, was removed, but it used to be the Renault Otsu with 22 degrees of gun depression. But for currently in the game, it's actually the R35 with 16 degrees of gun depression, which is pretty good in terms of gun depression. Now, the worst in terms of gun depression for tier 1 was actually an event, and I can't even quite remember this, even if it really needed or had, or I think the gun was really unique, but it's labeled as the War Duck with 0 degrees of gun depression. Don't even have to worry about that. It's not even like in the game, just was an event. But in the game, for the worst gun depression, the tank that had that was the M2 light tank with 6 degrees of gun depression. So once again, if you're coming across different tanks and you watch this video and you realize when playing that, oh, that tank actually has really good gun depression, you may want to be very careful when engaging that enemy in hilly terrain where they can do really, really well with that. Whereas if you're the tank that has bad gun depression, you may want to stay on flatter ground and kind of move around those hills and so forth, and kind of utilizing your tank's attributes. Going into tier 2, the tank with the best gun depression was actually the D1 with 18 degrees of gun depression. And the tank with the worst gun depression was actually the T7 combat car with 4 degrees of gun depression. So quite interesting there. It's kind of funny because these earlier tiers have like this crazy amount of gun depression. And then when you get to the later tiers, you'll kind of see there's not like as much as some of these tier 1s, but 18 degrees is incredible. So going into tier 3, the tank with the best gun depression is actually the Cruiser Mark IV with 15 degrees of gun depression. Really good. And the tank with the worst gun depression at tier 3 is the UE57 with only 2 degrees of gun depression. That is barely anything. That basically means you can't even really get your cannon down at all. And how I basically categorize this is tanks with 5 degrees or less, you have pretty bad gun depression. tanks that have basically from 6 to about 8 degrees of gun depression is okay, but you still want to be a little careful. And I would consider anything from 9 degrees and up is actually pretty good. And then if you're even getting up to 12 and up, I mean, you have dang good gun depression. And then going into tier 4, the tanks with the best gun depression is the Covenanter and the Type 1 Chi-He with 15 degrees. So pretty good. And then the worst for gun depression at tier 4 is the Electo and the Su-85B with only 5 degrees. Going into tier 5, the tank with the best gun depression was actually the STRV M42 with 15 degrees of gun depression. And the tank with the worst was actually the Churchill 1 with only 4 degrees of gun depression. Going into tier 6, the tank with the best gun depression is the Dicker Max with 15 degrees. And the tanks with the worst, came down to 2 of them, was actually the AMX 12T and the Churchill 7 with only 4 degrees of gun depression. Going into tier 7, the tanks with the best gun depression was the Stour Mill at 15 degrees. Once again, really good. But some other noteworthy ones I did want to mention, because if you do come across these, they have pretty good gun depression. As a matter of fact, best of the light and medium category and heavy category. And wanted to mention it could help you out when coming across these, but the Comment has actually 12 degrees of gun depression, and the Lupus as a heavy actually also has 12 degrees of gun depression. And then going into the worst is the Vindicator and the SU-100 M1 with both having only 2 degrees of gun depression, which is once again really bad. Now, for tier 8, there's actually quite a bit, so I'm actually just going to post the list here. It may seem like this is every tank in the game, but out of the 81 or so tanks of tier 8 that exist in the game, there's 34 tanks that have 10 degrees of gun depression, and I've categorized them here from the light and mediums that have 10 degrees, the heavy tanks that have 10 degrees, and the tank destroyers that have 10 degrees. But nothing has over 10 degrees of gun depression. But these are the tanks when coming across, you want to be very careful because they're very, very good at hills and things of that sort, having the most gun depression at 10 degrees of tier 8. And then for the worst at tier 8, it was actually the the SU-101 with only 4 degrees of gun depression. And I think I remember when playing that tank, it did actually make it a bit difficult with only having 4 degrees. That is a challenge. And then going into tier 9, kind of the same thing here. Out of the 37 or so tanks at tier 9, 12 of them have 10 degrees of gun depression. Nothing has better than 10 degrees. 10 degrees is still pretty good, something you do want to definitely be careful of. But these are the tanks with 10 degrees of gun depression. Once again, there's 12 of them out of the 37, I believe. And then for the tank with the worst gun depression at tier 9 was actually the WZ-120 with only 3 degrees of gun depression, which is pretty bad. Going into tier 10, you have the tanks. There's a list here. Out of the 46 or so tier 10 tanks that exist in the game, there's 13 of them that have 10 degrees of gun depression that you want to be careful of. And here's the list of them here. And then, so if you do come across these, you want to be careful, once again, if you are coming across them against like hilly terrains, things of that sort, because these tanks can do good in those situations. And then for the tank with the worst gun depression at tier 10 was actually the Object 263 with only 4 degrees. So hopefully this list was helpful, gave you some context, some perspective in terms of when engaging certain enemies, what to be careful of, as that could actually be a strength of that tank, or it could actually be a weakness if it doesn't have very good gun depression, and you can actually use those hills to put that tank in a bad spot. So anyway, once again, this is the Muffin here. You guys stay cool and keep tanking.